4:35 in the morning. The Strait of Hormuz. USS Carney was leading USS Mason through the narrowest reach of the world's most volatile maritime choke point when the passive sonar array registered a sound that defied every known acoustic profile. Within 300 seconds, two of the most advanced destroyers in the United States Navy would be resting on the floor of the Persian Gulf. The humid night air was thick with the smell of salt and diesel, clinging heavily to the steel of the superstructure, as the ships maintained a steady speed of 18 knots. Above, a moonless sky offered no hint of the kinetic energy already streaking through the water from the Iranian coastline. The two ARLEIGH BURKE-class destroyers, designated DDG-64 and DDG-87, were operating under Modified Condition 2 readiness. They were escorting a high-value commercial transit, their ANSPY-1 radar systems sweeping the horizon for any sign of Iranian fast-attack craft or anti-ship cruise missiles. For 72 hours, the crews had been at their stations, eyes strained against the green glow of monitors in the Combat Information Center. Despite the tension, the mission was considered a standard freedom of navigation operation until the moment the acoustic signature shifted from a low hum to a high-pitched scream. Less than 12 miles to the east, hidden within the jagged limestone caves of the Bandar Abbas coastline, an Iranian Hoot torpedo battery had been waiting for this exact transit. The Hoot is a supercavitating weapon, a specialized rocket-propelled torpedo designed to travel at speeds exceeding 200 knots. By generating a bubble of gas around its nose, the weapon eliminates nearly all skin friction, allowing it to fly through the water rather than swim. At such speeds, the traditional defensive measures of a modern destroyer, decoys, acoustic jammers, and evasive maneuvers are rendered almost entirely obsolete. The commanding officer of the USS Carney was standing at the central console when the sonar operator shouted the first warning. The signature was moving at 370 kilometers per hour. In the cold, analytical environment of the Combat Information Center, the math was simple and devastating. At that range and speed, the crew had less than 90 seconds to identify the threat, authorize a counter-response, and execute a turn. The tactical action officer immediately called for flank speed, the 4 gas turbine engines of the Carney roaring to life as they attempted to push the 9,000-ton vessel out of the path of the incoming fire. USS Mason, trailing 2,000 yards behind, saw the thermal bloom on its infrared sensors almost immediately. The Iranian battery had not fired a single shot. They had launched a coordinated 4-round salvo. 2 torpedoes were locked onto the Carney, while the remaining 2 were vectored toward the Mason. The water behind the torpedoes was boiling, leaving white scars on the surface of the Gulf that were visible even in the darkness. The sheer velocity of the Hoot torpedoes meant that the destroyers were not facing a traditional naval engagement, but rather a subsurface artillery strike. The United States Navy crews acted with the precision of years of training. The Mark 41 vertical launch systems were armed, and the close-in weapon systems were shifted to manual override. But there was a fundamental problem. These systems were designed to intercept missiles in the air, not rocket-propelled projectiles moving through the water at the speed of a commuter aircraft. The sonar suite continued to track the 4 contacts, the icons on the digital displays closing the distance with terrifying speed. At 4:37 in the morning, the first Hoot torpedo crossed the 500-meter mark from the USS Carney. The destroyer was mid-turn, its hull heeling over as it fought the physics of its own mass. The air on the bridge was filled with the rhythmic pulse of the collision alarm, a sound that would be the last thing many of the sailors would ever hear. On the Iranian coast, the battery commanders watched their monitors with silent intensity, knowing that the window of engagement was closing. They had achieved the ultimate tactical surprise, bypassing the most sophisticated electronic shield in history through the use of raw, unguided kinetic speed. The silence of the morning was about to be shattered by the sound of high-tensile steel being torn apart like wet paper. The engagement had moved beyond the realm of strategy and into the realm of survival. To understand the catastrophe unfolding in the Strait of Hormuz, one must first understand the physics of the weapon that had just been unleashed. The Iranian Hoot, or whale, is a supercavitating torpedo that represents a violent departure from traditional naval engineering. While a standard American Mark 48 heavyweight torpedo swims through the water at roughly 50 knots, the Hoot flies through it at speeds exceeding 200 knots. This is made possible by a specialized nose cone that generates a bubble of gas, enveloping the entire projectile and reducing water friction to nearly zero. The weapon does not rely on propellers for propulsion. It is driven by a high-thrust solid-fuel rocket motor that burns with a blinding underwater intensity. The technical challenge for the crew of the USS Carney was absolute and immediate. The destroyer, DDG-64, was designed around the Aegis combat system, a sophisticated network of ANSPY-1 radars and computers capable of managing a massive air-to-air engagement. However, the Aegis system was built to defeat threats in the atmosphere, not beneath the surface of the sea. The ship's sonar array, while capable of detecting traditional submarines and torpedoes at long ranges, struggled to process a contact moving at 370 kilometers per hour. The acoustic signature of the Hoot was not the rhythmic pulsing of a screw, but the sustained, deafening roar of a rocket engine muffled by a wall of water. The air inside the Combat Information Center on the USS Carney was cold and smelled of ozone, a sharp contrast to the humid salt air on the deck. The tactical action officer stared at the screen as the computer struggled to calculate a solution for an object that was closing the distance faster than some helicopters. The Hoot is traditionally an unguided weapon, a straight runner that relies on high-speed kinetic impact rather than sophisticated homing sensors. This simplicity made it immune to the acoustic jammers and decoy launchers the Carney had deployed into the water. There was no internal logic to confuse, no sensor to blind. There was only a 500-kilogram warhead encased in steel, moving too fast for the laws of traditional naval defense to apply. Beneath the waterline, the hull of the destroyer was already feeling the physical pressure of the incoming wave. The 4 gas turbine engines were screaming at full power, creating a deep vibration that could be felt in the marrow of every sailor's bones. The engineering crew, working in temperatures exceeding 100 degrees, fought to maintain the massive output required for an emergency breakaway maneuver. Despite their professionalism, the mechanical limits of a 9,000-ton vessel were being reached. A destroyer cannot turn on a dime, and the Hoot torpedoes had been launched at a range that left no room for error. The threat to the ARLEIGH BURKE class was not just the warhead, but the immense kinetic energy of the projectile itself. At 200 knots, the Hoot becomes a supersonic hammer. Even a non-explosive impact at that velocity would be enough to punch through the thin skin of a modern destroyer's hull. The United States Navy had long prioritized speed and electronic warfare over heavy armor, a trade-off that was now being brutally exploited by a weapon that bypassed electronic defenses entirely. The Iranian battery commanders had calculated the intercept geometry perfectly, lead-lining the Carney so that the ship would sail directly into the path of the first 2 rounds. On the bridge of the USS Mason, the executive officer watched the radar feed with a sense of growing horror. They could see the Carney struggling to clear the kill zone, the massive wake of the lead destroyer turning the surface of the strait into a chaotic churn of white foam. The Mason itself was now the target of the second pair of torpedoes. The tactical officers coordinated a frantic effort to use the 5-inch deck gun to fire into the water, hoping to create enough of a shockwave to disrupt the gas bubble of the incoming Hoots. It was a desperate, unproven tactic, born of the realization that their primary defenses were failing. The salt spray from the churning sea was hitting the glass of the bridge windows as the Mason heeled over at 30 degrees. The crew on the deck could see the white streaks in the water, like silver arrows shot from the darkness of the Iranian coast. The engagement was now less than 60 seconds from its first impact. In the silence between the alarms, the only sound was the rushing of the wind and the deep, rhythmic thumping of the ship's heart. The technical superiority of the world's most powerful navy was being tested by the raw, unguided speed of a weapon that refused to follow the rules of modern combat. 4:38 in the morning. The midships of the USS Carney. The hull was vibrating with such intensity that the paint on the bulkheads, began to flake as the destroyer fought to outrun the physics of a weapon moving at 370 kilometers per hour. There was no time for a secondary alarm. 1 second, the sonar display showed a contact at 200 meters, and the next, the very fabric of the ship was being reconstructed by raw kinetic force. The first Hoot torpedo did not explode upon contact. It punched through the steel plating of the hull like a high-velocity sabot round. The supercavitating bubble collapsed an instant before impact, allowing the heavy tungsten nose of the weapon to drive deep into the engineering spaces. The sound was not a bang, but a sustained, screaming tear of metal on metal that vibrated through every deck and compartment. 3,000 tons of seawater followed the vacuum left by the projectile, a wall of black ocean slamming into the gas turbine enclosures at a pressure of 80 pounds per square inch. The air in the lower decks was instantly replaced by a mist of atomized fuel and freezing salt spray. Sailors in the auxiliary machinery room were thrown against the bulkheads by a shock wave that felt like a physical blow to the chest. The heat from the ruptured fuel lines ignited almost immediately, creating a localized inferno that fought against the rising water. The smell of burning oil and ozone filled the passageways, thick enough to choke those who were trying to reach the emergency breathing apparatus stations. The second Hoot torpedo struck 45 feet aft of the first breach, specifically targeting the propeller shafts. This impact was even more catastrophic for the ship's mobility. The weapon severed the starboard shaft and drove a massive section of the hull plating upward, bucking the deck plates in the aft mess decks. Men who had been sleeping in their racks were tossed like rag dolls as the ship heeled violently to port. The USS Carney was no longer a combat vessel. It was a 9,000-ton piece of steel that was losing its battle with gravity and the sea. On the bridge, the commanding officer felt the deck lurch and stay tilted at a steep angle. The digital displays flickered, then died as the main power bus was severed by the flooding in the engineering spaces. Red emergency lighting bathed the bridge in a bloody hue, casting long, frantic shadows as the crew worked to restore communications and command. The tactical action officer reported a total loss of propulsion and a rapidly increasing list to the port side. Outside the bridge windows, the Strait of Hormuz remained dark, save for the white, frothing scar of the Carney's wake as the ship began to lose its forward momentum. Less than 1 mile away, the crew of the USS Mason watched their sister ship's silhouette change in the darkness. The Carney was visibly lower in the water, a plume of black smoke beginning to rise from the midships and drifting toward the Iranian coast. The radio channels were a cacophony of damage control reports and calls for medical assistance layered over the steady pulse of the collision alarms. The Mason was still under fire, its own sensors tracking 2 more Hoot torpedoes that were now less than 2,000 meters away. The ocean around the 2 ships was a chaotic mess of foam and debris, illuminated by the orange glow of the fires burning deep within the Carney's hull. The first 3 minutes of the engagement had effectively neutralized the primary air defense asset of the strike group in this sector. The Carney was drifting, its hull open to the sea, and its crew fighting for their lives in the dark. The professionalism of the damage control teams was the only thing preventing an immediate capsizing, as they hammered shoring into place and fought to isolate the flooding with desperate speed. But the sea is an unforgiving adversary. When the hull has been compromised by 2,000 kilograms of high-speed steel and high-explosive warheads. The smell of the sea was now inside the ship, mixing with the metallic tang of blood and the chemical bite of the fire-extinguishing foam. Every sailor on the Carney knew that the next few minutes would decide if the ship stayed afloat or became a tomb. Meanwhile, the USS Mason was entering its own 5-minute window of survival, the white streaks of the Iranian torpedoes closing the gap with every heartbeat of the engines. 4:39 in the morning. Deep within the hull of the USS Carney, the damage control teams from Repair Locker 5 were moving through knee-deep seawater and thick, black fuel oil less than 2 minutes after the first impact. The air was a choking mixture of atomized diesel, salt spray, and the acrid smell of burning electrical insulation. Every bulkhead groaned under the weight of the Persian Gulf, pressing against the ruptured steel of the engine room. The sailors fought for footing on the slick, angled decks, as the ship's list increased to 12 degrees. This was the most critical phase of the engagement for the DDG-64, as the crew attempted to counteract a flood rate, estimated at 80,000 gallons per minute. The damage control officer, a lieutenant commander with 12 years of experience, called for the immediate activation of the Halon fire suppression system in the main engine room. However, the internal communication lines had been severed by the kinetic shock of the Hoot torpedo, forcing the crew to rely on messengers and handheld radios. The primary electrical bus had failed, leaving the lower decks in a terrifying darkness, broken only by the dim, red glow of emergency lanterns and the beams of tactical flashlights. The sound of rushing water was a constant, low-frequency roar that drowned out the voices of the petty officers attempting to coordinate the response. Teams of 4 sailors each hauled portable Pone 100 pumps down the narrow, vertical ladders of the interior passageways. These pumps, capable of moving 100 gallons of water per minute, were the last line of defense against the rising tide inside the hull. The temperature in the engineering spaces had reached 140 degrees Fahrenheit due to the ruptured steam lines and localized fires. Every breath was a struggle as the humidity hit 100%, the moisture condensing on the faces and gear of the damage control parties. They were wearing full flash gear and heavy oxygen canisters, adding 40 pounds of weight to their already exhausted bodies. In the auxiliary machinery room, a chief petty officer led a team to install emergency shoring against a buckling bulkhead. They used heavy timbers of Douglas fir, cut to length and wedged into place with sledgehammers, to provide temporary structural support. The steel of the hull was vibrating with the secondary explosions of electrical transformers shorting out in the salt water. Despite the professional discipline of the United States Navy training, the physical reality of the damage was overwhelming. The first Hoot torpedo had created a breach 5 meters wide, and no amount of timber or steel could stop the volume of water entering the ship at 80 pounds per square inch of pressure. The list to the port side increased to 18 degrees within 90 seconds. On the mess decks, heavy tables and chairs that had been bolted to the floor began to tear away from their mounts, sliding across the deck with a metallic scream. The ship's center of gravity was shifting as the thousands of tons of water moved freely across the lower compartments. This free surface effect was the greatest threat to the ship's stability, as every degree of tilt made it more likely that the vessel would simply roll over. The crew on the upper decks were already preparing life rafts, though no order to abandon ship had yet been given by the commanding officer. Outside, the environmental conditions remained deceptive in their stillness. The Persian Gulf was running 1-meter swells, and the air carried the faint, iron smell of the sea mixed with the heavy smoke pouring from the Carney's midships. The silence of the night had been replaced by the mechanical death rattle of a billion-dollar warship. The infrared cameras of the nearby Iranian coastal batteries recorded the scene in high definition, tracking the thermal signatures of the fires and the cold, dark mass of the water filling the hull. They could see the Carney slowing to a crawl, its wake disappearing as the propellers finally stopped turning. On the bridge, the executive officer was monitoring the fuel levels and the status of the remaining watertight doors. The reports coming in from the repair lockers were increasingly grim. 3 of the 4 main engines were submerged, and the emergency generators were struggling to stay online under the massive load of the pumps. The structural integrity of the keel was now in question, as the weight of the water in the engine rooms began to strain the very frame of the destroyer. The Carney was fighting a 20-40, losing battle against the laws of buoyancy, and time was running out. 4:40 in the morning, the Strait of Hormuz. USS Mason was already at flank speed, her 4 gas turbine engines screaming, as they pushed the 9,000-ton destroyer to 30 knots in a desperate attempt to clear the kill zone. The commanding officer of the DDG-87 had watched the thermal bloom of the Carney's impact and knew that his ship had less than 60 seconds before the second pair of Hoot torpedoes arrived. The air on the bridge was charged with static and the sharp, ozone smell of overworked electronics. Outside, the black water of the Gulf was being shredded into white foam by the Mason's hull as she heeled 20 degrees to starboard in a hard-over turn. The tactical action officer in the Combat Information Center made a split-second decision that had never been tested in live combat. He ordered the Mark 45 5-inch 62 caliber naval gun to engage the water directly in the path of the incoming torpedoes. The goal was not a direct hit, which was mathematically improbable, but to create a series of massive underwater shockwaves that might collapse the supercavitating gas bubbles surrounding the Hoot projectiles. If the bubble collapsed, the torpedo would instantly slam into a wall of water at 300 kilometers per hour, effectively tearing itself apart. The 5-inch gun began to cycle, firing high-explosive rounds into the sea at a rate of 20 per minute. Each detonation sent a pillar of white water 50 feet into the air, the shockwaves rattling the Mason's hull and vibrating through the soles of the sailors' boots. The close-in weapon system, the 20mm phalanx Gatling gun, also opened fire, spraying a stream of tungsten armor-piercing rounds into the surf. The night was lit by the rhythmic flashes of the muzzles, the smell of burnt cordite drifting back over the superstructure and mixing with the salt spray. The two Hoot torpedoes were now less than 800 meters away. On the sonar display, they appeared as two white streaks of pure kinetic energy, unaffected by the wall of explosions the Mason was throwing into their path. The Iranian battery commanders had timed the salvo perfectly, ensuring the Mason was bracketed with no room for further maneuver. The distance closed to 400 meters, then 200. The pulse of the collision alarm reached a fever pitch, a high-frequency scream that cut through the roar of the engines and the thunder of the deck gun. The trigger was squeezed on the Iranian coastal battery for the final correction. The first Hoot torpedo shrieked through the final 50 meters of water, its rocket motor burning with a white-hot intensity that boiled the sea in its wake. The heat blast from the exhaust was so intense, it registered on the Mason's short-range infrared sensors an instant before the end. Steel met steel. The weapon did not deflect. It drove straight through the turbulent wake of the 5-inch shell splashes, its tungsten nose focused on the Mason's midships. The warhead punched straight through the thin aluminum and steel plating of the hull, detonating in the auxiliary machine room number 2. The hull plating did not just bend, it shattered into thousands of jagged fragments that were driven through the compartment like shrapnel. The 300-kilogram high-explosive charge erupted instantly, creating a fireball that bleached the night sky white for 3 full seconds. The blast wave threw sailors off their feet across 4 decks, the overpressure compressing every chest in the compartment and rupturing eardrums with a sound like the world itself was cracking open. The Mason reacted violently to the blow. The ship was wrenched 10 degrees further to starboard, the deck beneath, crew's feet bucking as the structural spine of the vessel groaned under the stress. The engineering officer kicked the rudder, hard left, in a reflexive attempt to counter the roll, but the steering gear had already been severed by the explosion. The fire was moving faster than the crew could react, chasing through the cable trunks and finding the main fuel manifold. A second, smaller eruption blew the hatches off the vertical launch system, sending a plume of black smoke and orange flame 200 feet into the air. Black smoke rose from the gaping wound in the Mason's side, a hole large enough to drive a truck through. The ship began to lose speed immediately, her forward momentum dying as the sea rushed into the breach at a rate of 60,000 gallons per minute. The radio channels, which had been filled with coordinated commands, went into a dead silence for exactly 5 seconds before erupting in a chaos of overlapping voices and screams for medical aid. The 2 most advanced destroyers in the region were now both dead in the water, their hulls glowing with the heat of internal fires that the Persian Gulf was already rising to extinguish. 4:42 in the morning. The central channel of the Strait of Hormuz. The structural integrity of the USS Carney, a vessel designed to endure the heavy stresses of modern naval warfare, was finally surrendered to the weight of 12,000 tons of seawater. The physical mechanics of the sinking were driven by a phenomenon known as longitudinal structural failure. Because the midships of the destroyer, DDG-64, had been hollowed out by 2 high-velocity Hoot torpedoes, The ship no longer possessed the buoyancy to support its own bow and stern. The keel, the heavy steel spine of the vessel, began to bend upward in a process called hogging. The sound was a subterranean groan that vibrated through the water, followed by a series of sharp, rhythmic cracks as the primary weld seams reached their breaking point and snapped. Inside the hull, the free surface effect had reached its terminal phase. The massive volume of water in the engine rooms was no longer contained by internal bulkheads, allowing it to lurch from side to side with every movement of the sea. This shifted the ship's center of gravity far outside its stable axis. At 4:43, the USS Carney underwent a final, irreversible roll to the port side. The masts and the ANSPY-1 radar arrays, the eyes of the fleet, dipped into the black water of the Gulf. Within 60 seconds, the bow rose 40 degrees into the air, the red anti-fouling paint on the hull visible for a brief moment under the emergency lights of the nearby escort vessels before the ship slid backward into the depths. The USS Mason was meeting an equally violent end less than 2,000 yards away. The fire in the forward vertical launch system had reached a critical temperature, causing the solid rocket motors of the evolved Sea Sparrow missiles to cook off. This was not a controlled launch, but a series of internal explosions that tore through the forward deckhouse. The heat was so intense, it melted the aluminum structure of the bridge, turning the command center into a ruin of twisted metal and slag. The resulting breach in the forward hull destroyed the ship's remaining reserve buoyancy. The Mason did not roll. She settled straight down by the head, her stern rising out of the water, until the twin bronze propellers were spinning in the empty night air. The human cost of the 5-minute engagement was catastrophic. Of the 330 sailors aboard the USS Carney, 112 were confirmed killed in action or missing within the first 300 seconds. Many were trapped in the lower engineering spaces when the Hoot torpedoes made their initial high-velocity entry, leaving no time for egress through the vertical escape trunks. On the USS Mason, the casualties were concentrated in the forward repair lockers and the bridge, where 84 personnel were lost to the combined effects of the torpedo impact and the secondary missile cook-off. The survivors were left in the water, clinging to life rafts and debris in a sea that was now thick with the smell of burning fuel and hydraulic fluid. The physical environment of the strait had been transformed. The surface of the water was no longer a mirror of the night sky, but a chaotic field of white foam, floating wreckage, and the dark, spreading stain of several 100,000 gallons of marine diesel. The silence that followed the final plunge of the Mason was absolute, broken only by the distant, rhythmic thumping of Iranian fastboats, withdrawing toward the coast. The entire engagement, from the first sonar contact to the disappearance of 2 United States Navy destroyers from the radar screens of the 7th Fleet, had lasted exactly 5 minutes and 12 seconds. On the Iranian coast, the thermal signatures of the 2 ships vanished from the monitors, replaced by the cold, flat return of the open sea. The battery commanders did not celebrate. They immediately began the process of reloading and displacing their mobile launchers, anticipating the inevitable response from the carrier strike group. The technical success of the Hoot torpedo had been proven with brutal efficiency, leaving a void in the American defensive line that would take hours to fill. The survivors in the water, bobbing in the 1-meter swells, could only watch as the smoke from their ships drifted toward the horizon, a black shroud over the graveyard of the 2 most advanced warships in the Persian Gulf. 4:45 in the morning. 200 miles to the south of the disaster, the flight deck of the aircraft carrier USS Gerald R. Ford was a hive of controlled, violent energy. The news of the loss of the USS Carney and USS Mason had reached the strike group commander exactly 40 seconds after the Carney's radar signature vanished. Within 4 minutes, 2 FA-18 Gulf Growlers and 4 FA-18E Super Hornets were already hooked into the catapults, their engines screaming at full military power. The air on the flight deck was a thick, shimmering haze of heat and atomized jet fuel, the iron smell of the sea completely replaced by the chemical bite of burning kerosene. The mission was simple and absolute: find the source of the Hoot torpedo launches and erase it from the map. The Growlers led the way, their electronic warfare suites flooding the Iranian coastal frequencies with a wall of digital noise. Below them, the Strait of Hormuz was a dark void, save for the burning patches of oil that marked the graves of the two destroyers. The pilots of the Strike Fighter Squadron 87, known as the Golden Warriors, flew with a cold, professional fury. Their cockpit displays were filled with the infrared heat signatures of the Iranian mobile launchers as they attempted to retreat into the limestone caves along the Bandar Abbas coastline. The lead pilot of the Super Hornet flight leveled his wings and centered the targeting reticle on the largest thermal bloom. He squeezed the trigger. 4 AGM-88 HARM missiles shrieked off the rails, white columns of fire, punching backward through the humid air as they surged toward the Iranian coast at 3 times the speed of sound. The heat blast from the launches washed across the fuselage of the trailing wingman, a searing wave of chemical energy that bleached the darkness of the cockpit. 2 minutes later, the first 1,000-pound warhead punched through the mouth of the primary limestone cave, detonating deep inside the concealed magazine where the remaining Hoot torpedoes were stored. The mountain itself seemed to heave upward as 40 tons of stored rocket propellant and high explosives erupted instantly, sending 1,000 tons of shattered rock and twisted steel flying hundreds of meters into the strait. The Iranian battery crews attempted to drive their remaining mobile launchers toward the secondary exits, but the massive shock wave from the first hit collapsed the tunnel ceilings, crushing the vehicles and their operators in a single, white-hot flash. Black smoke boiled out of the shattered hillside, and the previously active radar signatures of the coastal defense network went into a dead silence that was broken only by the distant crackle of burning debris and the roar of the American jets overhead. The secondary strikes were equally devastating. The FA-18 fighters used laser-guided bombs to seal every known entrance to the subterranean complex. The limestone cliffs, which had provided sanctuary for the Iranian torpedo crews for years, were now a tomb of scorched stone and pulverized machinery. The thermal cameras on the Growlers recorded the secondary explosions as the fuel trucks inside the tunnels cooked off, sending jets of orange flame horizontal across the water. There was no maneuvering from the ground, no return fire from the anti-aircraft batteries. The speed and precision of the American response had decapitated the coastal defense sector before the second wave of torpedoes could even be moved to the rails. As the fighters banked back toward the carrier, the pilots looked down at the site where the Carney and Mason had been 5 minutes earlier. There were no ships left to see. The only evidence of the billion-dollar warships was a series of bright orange flares dropped by the surviving search and rescue helicopters. The air above the strait was now filled with the sound of MH-60 Sierra helicopters, their rotors beating against the humid air as they lowered rescue swimmers into the oil-slicked water. The retaliation had been successful, but it was a hollow victory. The Iranian battery was gone, but the gap in the American line was a wound that would take months to heal. The tactical report transmitted back to the aircraft carrier was brief. The threat had been neutralized with 98% confidence. Total ordnance expended included 12 air-to-surface missiles and 8 precision-guided bombs. The cost to the foreign military was measured in dozens of elite personnel and their most advanced subsurface weaponry. But as the sun began to peek over the horizon, the light only served to reveal the true scale of the military loss. The Persian Gulf was no longer just a transit corridor. It was now a combat zone where the rules of engagement had been rewritten in blood and fire. 5:15 in the morning. The central channel of the Strait of Hormuz. The air above the disaster site was thick with the heavy, rhythmic thumping of rotor blades as 4 MH-60 Sierra helicopters from the carrier strike group arrived on station. The darkness of the pre-dawn hour was shattered by the brilliant white beams of million-candle power searchlights, cutting through the black smoke that still clung to the surface of the water. Below the aircraft, the Persian Gulf was a nightmare of industrial wreckage and human endurance, A massive oil slick, nearly 2 miles long and composed of 300,000 gallons of marine diesel, smoothed the 1-meter swells into a viscous, shimmering carpet that smelled of raw fuel and old iron. The search and rescue swimmers, elite specialists trained for the most hostile maritime environments, were already standing in the open cabin doors of the helicopters. Each man was wearing a high-visibility lime green wetsuit, a heavy harness, and a pair of fins, with a chemical light stick taped to his shoulder. When the lead pilot reached the hover point, the signal was given. The swimmers dropped 10 feet into the oil-slicked water, their entry marked by a brief splash that was immediately swallowed by the roar of the engines. The water temperature was 84 degrees, but the chemical bite of the diesel fuel on exposed skin was an immediate and painful reality. The rescue operation was governed by the strict protocols of Combat Search and Rescue, or CSAR. Each helicopter was assigned a specific search grid, using forward-looking infrared sensors to detect the heat signatures of survivors against the cooling water. The sensors picked up dozens of small, flickering lights, the manual strobe lights, attached to the life vests of the sailors from the USS Carney and USS Mason. The survivors were scattered across a half-mile radius, clinging to 20-man inflatable life rafts, floating pieces of acoustic tiling, and each other. The physical state of the survivors was a testament to the violence of the Hoot torpedo impacts. Many were suffering from severe flash burns, their skin blackened by the fireballs that had swept through the engineering spaces. Others were struggling with the effects of blast overpressure, their lungs and ears damaged by the supersonic shock waves that had traveled through the steel of the ships. The rescue swimmers worked with a cold, mechanical efficiency, triaging the sailors in the water and prioritizing those who were unable to keep their heads above the oil-slicked surface. The oil was the greatest enemy. It coated the sailors' faces and filled their mouths, making every breath a struggle against suffocation. By 5:45 in the morning, the first group of 42 survivors had been hoisted into the cabins of the MH-60 Sierra helicopters. The first interior of the aircraft quickly became a frantic triage center, with corpsmen administering morphine and applying burn dressings while the pilots navigated the crowded airspace. The communication channels were a steady stream of coordinates and casualty counts, relayed back to the medical department of, quote, the USS Gerald R. Ford. The report was sobering. 68 personnel recovered with major injuries, 94 with minor injuries, and 231 still unaccounted for. Among the survivors in the water was the commanding officer of the USS Mason, who had been blown off the bridge by the secondary missile cook-off. He was found clinging to a floating piece of the ship's mast, his uniform shredded and his face streaked with black oil. Despite his injuries, he refused to be hoisted into the helicopter. Until the 3 sailors near him, all junior enlisted personnel from the engine room, were secured in the rescue baskets. It was a final act of leadership, in a morning that had seen the total destruction of his command. As the sun began to rise, over the jagged peaks of the Iranian coastline, the light revealed the true scale of the devastation. The water was littered with the personal belongings of 700 sailors, floating boots, charred notebooks, and the white caps of the United States Navy dress uniforms. The oil slick had turned a sickly shade of orange in the morning light, reflecting the fires that were still burning on. Some of the larger pieces of floating debris. The rescue helicopters continued their grim work, their crews scanning the water for any sign of life, but the intervals between successful recoveries were growing longer. The first phase of the rescue operation was nearing its end. The most visible survivors had been pulled from the sea, leaving behind a silence that was only broken by the distant call of the search pilots. The United States Navy had suffered its greatest single-day loss of life since the Second World War, and the process of notifying the families of the fallen was about to begin. The survivors on the flight decks of the survivors on the flight decks, remaining escort ships, looked back at the strait, their eyes hollowed by shock, watching the smoke of their ships finally dissipate into the clear morning sky. 72 hours after the engagement, The Pentagon, Washington, District of Columbia. The conference room was silent as the Chief of Naval Operations stood before the Joint Chiefs of Staff to deliver the final assessment of the encounter in the Strait of Hormuz. The air in the room was conditioned and dry, a sterile contrast to the humid, oil-slicked reality of the Persian Gulf. On the high-definition monitors, the final radar tracks of the destroyer DDG-64 and the destroyer DDG-87 were frozen in time. The report was titled "The 5-Minute Window," a stark acknowledgement of how quickly $2 billion of naval technology and nearly 200 American lives had been erased from the order of battle. The official casualty count was finalized at 196 personnel killed in action or missing and presumed dead. Of the survivors, 82 remained in critical condition at the Landstuhl Regional Medical Center in Germany, suffering from a combination of high-velocity shrapnel wounds, severe chemical burns from the marine diesel, and the psychological trauma of the rapid sinking. The loss represented the single greatest combat disaster for the United States Navy in the 21st century, a strategic shock that sent ripples through every naval command from Indo-Pacific Command to the 6th Fleet in the Mediterranean. The technical analysis of the Iranian Hoot torpedo was the centerpiece of the briefing. The report confirmed that the weapon's supercavitating technology allowed it to bypass the Aegis combat system by operating entirely beneath the radar and sonar detection thresholds of the ARLEIGH BURKE-class destroyers. The rocket-propelled projectiles had achieved an average speed of 370 kilometers per hour, leaving the crews of the Carney and Mason with less than 90 seconds to react from the moment of launch. The investigative team concluded that the unguided nature of the Hoot was actually its greatest advantage. By removing the electronic seeker, the weapon became immune to the standard acoustic decoys and electronic jamming suites that the United States Navy had relied upon for decades. In the wake of the disaster, the rules of engagement in the Persian Gulf were immediately and fundamentally rewritten. The Secretary of Defense authorized a new exclusion zone extending 25 miles from the Iranian coastline. Any subsurface or surface contact identified as a potential high-speed threat was now authorized for immediate engagement by the Carrier Strike Group's Air Wing. To fill the strategic void left by the sinking of the two destroyers, the carrier USS Gerald R remained on station, supported by 3 additional cruisers and 4 frigates diverted from the 7th Fleet. The United States Navy had achieved its secondary objective, the total destruction of the Bandar Abbas torpedo facility, but the cost had been disproportionate to the tactical gain. Logistically, the Navy Department began an emergency acceleration of the littoral combat ship program and the development of the Sea-Matrix subsurface interceptor. This new system, designed specifically to counter supercavitating threats, was moved from the prototype phase to active production within 48 hours of the Carney's sinking. The loss of the 2 destroyers had exposed a critical vulnerability in the fleet's defensive umbrella, forcing a radical shift in how the United States projected power in narrow maritime choke points. The final section of the report focused on the heroism of the crews during the 5-minute engagement. Despite the catastrophic nature of the impacts, the damage control teams had managed to keep the Carney afloat for an extra 90 seconds, allowing an additional 40 sailors to reach the dang life rafts. The commanding officer of the USS Mason was recommended for the Navy Cross for his actions in the water, specifically for refusing medical evacuation until his junior enlisted personnel were secured. These accounts of professional discipline and sacrifice were the only light in an otherwise dark chapter of American naval history. A memorial service was held on the flight deck of the Gerald R. As the sun set over the Gulf, 196 empty pairs of boots were lined up in neat rows against the edge of the elevator, reflecting the orange glow of the horizon. The sound of taps echoed across the still water, carried by the warm breeze that still smelled faintly of salt and jet fuel. The ships of the strike group stood in formation, their flags at half-mast, a silent wall of steel that remained committed to the mission despite the weight of the loss. The United States Navy had been bloodied, but its presence in the strait was unyielding. As the last notes of the bugle faded into the present sound of the waves, the carrier began to turn into the wind. The mission continued, but the names of the Carney and the Mason were now etched into the steel of every ship that followed them into the dark.